Aileen Seiden checked into room 15 at Greywood Inn, unaware it would be the last night of her life. Detective Miller and Detective Harlow stood over her lifeless body the next morning, searching for answers in a room that held no signs of struggle, only a single, chilling message scrawled in the guest book. "I'm not alone in room 15. Aileen Seiden arrived at the Greywood Inn just as the sun was setting behind the rolling hills of the quiet town. The inn stood at the edge of the main road, a 3-story structure with an old-fashioned charm. Its brick exterior was weathered, the wooden sign above the entrance slightly faded. It wasn't the kind of place that drew much attention, but for Aileen, that was exactly what made it interesting. She stepped inside, pulling her small suitcase behind her. The lobby had a warm yet strangely outdated atmosphere. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated with a thin layer of dust. The wooden reception desk looked as though it had been there for decades. An older man in a brown vest greeted her with a polite nod before handing her a room key. "Room 15, he said, sliding the key across the counter. "Up the stairs, down the hall to the left." Aileen noticed a flicker of something in his expression. Was it hesitation? Worry? She couldn't tell. And before she could ask, he turned his attention to a stack of papers beside him. Dismissing the thought, she took the key and made her way up the narrow staircase, the wood creaking beneath her every step. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit. The air smelled faintly of old books and something else, something she couldn't quite place. As she walked, she glanced at the numbers on the doors. Room 10, room 11, room 12. At the end of the hallway she found it, room 15. The key turned easily in the lock, and as she pushed the door open, a strange feeling washed over her. The room was ordinary: a queen-sized bed, a small wooden desk, a dresser with an old television on top. A single window overlooked the street below, its curtains swaying slightly, though there was no breeze. Aileen shrugged off the unease and set her suitcase down. She spent the next hour unpacking and setting up her laptop. She had come here to work on a historical feature about the inn. There were rumors that it had a long and eerie past, and while Aileen didn't believe in ghost stories, she was intrigued by the accounts of past guests. Some had spoken of whispers in the walls, others of fleeting shadows in the hallways. She figured most of it was exaggeration. Still, as she sat at the desk, reviewing her notes, a strange sound broke the silence. A faint creaking, as if someone had stepped just outside her door. She turned her head, listening intently. Nothing. The hallway, she reminded herself, was old. The wood likely expanded and settled with temperature changes. Shaking off her nerves, she decided to get some rest. She locked the door, turned off the light, and climbed into bed. But as she lay in the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The last thing she saw before drifting off was the shadow of her open closet door, standing just a little wider than she remembered. Detective Miller arrived at Greywood Inn early in the morning, his boots pressing against the damp pavement as he stepped out of his car. The inn stood quietly under the dull, gray sky, its aging bricks and dimly lit windows giving it an eerie stillness. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the entrance to room 15, fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. His partner, Detective Harlow, was already inside waiting for him. The room was undisturbed except for the presence of investigators. Aileen Seiden's body lay on the bed, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Her face was pale, lips slightly parted, and her hands rested loosely by her sides. There were no visible wounds, no signs of struggle. The blanket covered her up to her waist, as if she had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. Miller took a slow step forward, scanning the room. Aileen's belongings were neatly arranged, her suitcase by the dresser, her laptop still open on the desk, the screen dark. The closet door stood slightly ajar, its shadow stretching across the floor. He noticed the window. It was unlocked, open just an inch, though they were on the second floor. Outside, the fire escape led down to the alley behind the inn. Harlow stood near the door, flipping through a small notepad. "No forced entry," she said. The door was locked from the inside. Housekeeping found her like this when she didn't answer their knocks. Miller rubbed his chin. Any security cameras? None inside the inn. Only one by the front entrance, but it's old. Low quality. He nodded and moved toward the desk. Eileen's phone sat on the surface, its charging cable still plugged in. He tapped the screen. The battery was full, but there were no recent messages or calls. Next to the phone was the guest book, a leather-bound ledger provided by the inn for visitors to leave comments. Miller flipped through the pages until he reached Aileen's entry. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. "I'm not alone in room 15. Miller frowned. She wrote this. Harlow nodded. "Sometime last night. The ink is fresh." He glanced at Aileen's body again, his instincts telling him there was more to this than met the eye. The autopsy would confirm the cause of death, but something about the scene didn't sit right with him. There was no clear reason for her sudden passing. No medications, no alcohol, nothing to suggest a medical emergency. A soft creak sounded from the hallway. Both detectives turned. A hotel staff member, a woman in her 50s with nervous eyes, stood just outside the door. She hesitated before speaking. "You should check the history of this room," she said quietly. "People say it's cursed." Miller exchanged a look with Harlow. He didn't believe in curses, but something about the way the woman said it sent a chill through the air. Whatever had happened in room 15, it wasn't going to be a simple case. Detective Miller sat in his office, staring at the files spread out in front of him. The history of Greywood Inn was more unsettling than he had expected. The building itself had stood for nearly a century, but before it became an inn, the land had been home to a large mansion. That mansion had burned down in a mysterious fire, killing nearly everyone inside. The only survivor had been a young boy, Edward Seiden, the same surname as Aileen. Flipping through the documents, Miller found an old newspaper article. The fire had occurred in 1932, destroying the Seiden family estate. The article stated that investigators never determined the exact cause, but rumors spread through town that the fire was intentional. Some believed the Seidens had been cursed. Others whispered that one of them had set the fire on purpose. Miller leaned back in his chair. Could Eileen's death be connected to this? She had checked into the inn under her own name, not trying to hide her identity. If she had known about her family's past, why would she come here alone? Harlow entered the room, dropping another folder onto the desk. Autopsy report came in. Miller opened it quickly, scanning the findings. There were no signs of external injuries, no drugs or toxins in her system. The official cause of death was inconclusive cardiac arrest with no clear trigger. A perfectly healthy 28-year-old woman, dead without explanation. It didn't add up. "There's more," Harlow continued. "I dug into Aileen's recent research. She had been investigating her family history for months. Her grandfather, Edward Seiden, had tried to warn people about the inn. He claimed it was cursed, said strange things happened there. Most people dismissed him as crazy, but Aileen seemed to believe there was something worth uncovering." Miller flipped through the pages, stopping at a photocopy of an old letter. It was handwritten, addressed to Aileen from an unknown sender. "Stay away from Greywood Inn. You don't know what you're dealing with." The letter had no signature, no return address. Aileen had ignored the warning. Harlow exhaled slowly. "Here's where it gets stranger. I spoke with some of the older residents in town. They remember Edward Seiden. Said he lived in fear until the day he died. He claimed the spirits of his family never left the house, that something followed him for years." Miller tapped his fingers against the desk. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the coincidences were piling up. So Aileen went there to uncover the truth, and now she's dead. Harlow nodded. And she was convinced something was in that room with her. Miller looked back at the guest book entry. "I'm not alone in room 15. Whether Aileen had been scared, threatened, or simply paranoid, One thing was clear: she had sensed something before she died, and whatever it was, it had left no trace behind. Detective Miller and Detective Harlow focused their efforts on Aileen's recent activities. If she had been researching her family history, there had to be more pieces to the puzzle. They started with her laptop, which had been recovered from room 15. The device was locked, but with the help of forensic experts, they accessed her files. The documents revealed something unexpected. Aileen had uncovered old town records, suggesting that Seiden had not just been a victim of the fire but had played a role in it. A passage from her notes stood out. Seiden was the only survivor, but was it by chance? Some sources claim he had a history of conflict with his family. If he started the fire, was it an accident or something more sinister? Miller rubbed his temples. If Aileen had found evidence suggesting her great-grandfather had set the fire, she might have been getting close to a dangerous truth. He scrolled further through her notes and found something even more chilling. Edward had been linked to a series of disappearances in the town years after the fire. Several people who had stayed at the inn under his ownership had vanished without explanation. Harlow leaned over the desk. So she wasn't just researching the fire. She was connecting it to something bigger. Miller nodded, and someone didn't want her to. They turned their attention to the hidden letter found in Aileen's belongings. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. Someone had been trying to warn her away. But who? Harlow decided to follow up on one more lead: Aileen's last phone call. Phone records showed that she had spoken with someone for nearly an hour just 2 days before she died. That call had come from a local landline. When they traced the number, they found it belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret Langley, who had once worked as a maid at the Greywood Inn decades ago. When they visited her home, Margaret was hesitant to talk, but after some pressing, she revealed something shocking. Aileen came to me, she admitted. She wanted to know about the old days, about Seiden. Margaret lowered her voice as if someone might be listening. I told her not to go back there. I told her the Seiden family had secrets, terrible secrets. Edward wasn't just a survivor of that fire. He caused it. He wanted that house for himself, and when he couldn't have it, he destroyed it. But the fire didn't take everything. Some things lingered. Miller felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated before answering. Edward always said that the house never forgave him, that the past had a way of claiming what was owed. Harlow frowned. Are you saying Aileen was targeted because of her family's history? Margaret looked away. She went digging too deep. Just like Edward, she stirred something that should have stayed buried. For the first time, the detectives wondered if Aileen's death had been more than a crime. What if it had been a warning? Detective Miller and Detective Harlow knew they were close to the truth, but there were still unanswered questions. Aileen Seiden had uncovered something dangerous, something that had cost her life. The key to solving the case lay in understanding who had the most to lose if her discoveries became public. They went back to Aileen's records, looking for anyone she had contacted in the days before her death. One name stood out: Lily Seiden, Aileen's mother. She had called her daughter multiple times before Aileen's trip to Greywood Inn. The detectives decided it was time to pay her a visit. Lily Seiden lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city. When she opened the door, there was something guarded about her expression, as if she had been expecting them. She invited them in, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured them tea. We're here about Aileen, Miller said. Lily's eyes flickered with something unreadable. I already told the police everything I know. Harlow placed a copy of Aileen's notes on the table. She found out about Seiden. She knew he wasn't just a victim of the fire. She suspected he had caused it. Lily's lips pressed together. She was chasing shadows. Miller leaned forward. She wasn't just researching history. She was close to exposing something. Something someone didn't want her to reveal. He paused. You called her multiple times before her trip. What were you trying to warn her about? Lily's composure cracked. Her eyes filled with tears, and she exhaled shakily. I told her not to go, she admitted. I begged her to stop digging. Harlow's voice was gentle but firm. Why? Lily hesitated, then finally spoke. Because I knew the truth. My father, Edward Seiden, was guilty. He set that fire. He destroyed his own family because of his greed. And when he survived, he spent the rest of his life trying to cover his sins. Miller studied her. But why kill Aileen? Lily looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. Because she wouldn't stop. She wiped at her eyes. I thought if she just left it alone, the past would stay buried. But she went to that place. She dug too deep. And I couldn't let her do it. The detectives exchanged glances. The realization settled over them like a heavy weight. Aileen Seiden hadn't died because of a curse. She hadn't been taken by ghosts or spirits from the past. She had been murdered by her own mother, a woman so desperate to keep the family's dark history hidden that she had silenced her own daughter. Lily didn't resist when they arrested her. As she was led away, she whispered she wouldn't listen. She should have listened. The case was closed, but the legend of Room 15 remained. Some mysteries could be explained, but others lingered, whispering through the walls of Greywood Inn, waiting for the next visitor who dared to uncover the past.